There are very few people who spent real, sustained time inside Michael Jackson's inner circle and never wrote a book, never sat for a tabloid tell-all, and never cashed in on their proximity to one of the most famous men who ever lived. Debbie Rowe is one of them. For nearly 3 decades, she has been a footnote in someone else's biography, the mother of his kids, the dermatology nurse, the ex-wife, when in reality her story is far stranger and far more human than the tabloids ever let on. She was not a pop star's trophy wife. She was not, by most accounts, even his lover in any conventional sense. She was something harder to categorize: a friend who became a surrogate, a wife who was never quite a spouse, and a mother who deliberately stepped back so her children could call someone else Mom. It's worth being upfront about something before we go further. You may have seen headlines claiming Rowe has finally broken her silence at 66, as though decades of quiet suddenly gave way to some dramatic new confession. That framing is circulated widely online, but it doesn't match any verified new interview. What actually exists is a real record, built up gradually over more than 20 years courtroom testimony, sworn depositions, a handful of interviews given at specific moments for specific reasons, and the public documents of 2 of the most scrutinized legal proceedings in modern entertainment history. That record is less sensational than the clickbait version, but it's also more interesting, because it shows a woman whose choices only make sense when you follow them in order, from a Beverly Hills dermatology office in the 1980s to a horse ranch in the California desert today. Debbie Rowe was born on December 6, 1958, in Spokane, Washington, and grew up mostly under the care of her mother and aunts after her parents divorced. There was nothing in her early life that pointed toward fame. She trained as a medical assistant and eventually found steady work in the Beverly Hills office of Dr. Arnold Klein, a dermatologist whose client list read like a who's who of Hollywood. It was there, in the mid-1980s, that she first met Michael Jackson, who came to Klein for treatment related to his skin condition. At the time, nobody could have predicted where that professional relationship would lead. Rowe was simply the nurse who prepped his treatments, took his vitals, and, in the process, became one of the few people around him who didn't seem to want anything from him. That, according to people who observed their dynamic over the years, was precisely what drew Jackson to her. He was surrounded by managers, lawyers, publicists, and hangers on who all had a stake in his image or his money. Rowe had a stake in neither. She just showed up, did her job, and talked to him like a person instead of a phenomenon. Their bond deepened slowly, and by most accounts platonically. Both were navigating painful chapters in their personal lives. Rowe was going through her own divorce, and Jackson was dealing with the fallout of his short, tumultuous marriage to Lisa Marie Presley, which ended in 1996. They leaned on each other. Rowe had, by her own admission, long harbored deep admiration for Jackson, something closer to devotion than a simple crush. But what mattered more in the years leading up to their marriage was the emotional scaffolding she provided during some of the darkest periods of his life, including the child molestation allegations that first surfaced in 1993. Jackson wanted more than almost anything else to be a father. Presley, who already had a child from a previous relationship, was unwilling to have a baby with him, a disagreement that contributed to the collapse of their marriage. Jackson's mother, Catherine, reportedly urged him not to have a child outside of marriage, worried about the backlash it would invite. So when Rowe, after suffering a miscarriage of her own in early 1996, offered to carry his child, it solved 2 problems at once. Jackson could become a father, and Rowe could give him something no one else in his orbit seemed willing or able to give. On November 14, 1996, Michael Jackson and Debbie Rowe were married in a hotel ceremony in Sydney, Australia, with only a small circle of people present, reportedly around 15 guests. Jackson's young nephew stood in as best man. The wedding was arranged and announced quietly through Jackson's publicist rather than staged for cameras, a striking departure from the media circus that had surrounded his marriage to Presley. Rowe was already pregnant at the time. From the outside, tabloids speculated endlessly about what kind of marriage this really was. From the inside, according to later testimony and interviews, it was never a conventional one. The 2 reportedly never lived together in the traditional sense, and did not share a household as husband and wife in the way the public assumed. Their son, Michael Joseph Jackson Jr., known to the world as Prince, was born in February 1997. Their daughter, Paris Michael Catherine Jackson, followed in April 1998. For Rowe, having children was never really about wanting to be a mother in the day-to-day sense. She has said plainly on more than one occasion that her motivation was to give Jackson the chance to become a father, not to fulfill some maternal ambition of her own. What followed was one of the strangest arrangements in celebrity history. Rowe and Jackson divorced in 1999, and Rowe initially gave up custody rights, allowing Jackson to raise Prince and Paris, largely with the help of nannies and household staff at Neverland Ranch. She has said candidly that she never wanted her children calling her Mom, because in her view, they were Michael's children. That decision, whatever the public made of it, reflected a self-awareness about the role she had. Agreed to play from the very beginning, she was there to make his fatherhood possible, not to compete with it. The financial terms of the split were significant. Reports place her settlement at somewhere around $8.5 million, which reportedly included cash, property, and other assets, along with an additional payment tied to a confidentiality agreement. Whatever the exact figures, the money was never the part of the story Rowe seemed interested in defending. In a 1999 interview with a Los Angeles news station, she said in essence that she hadn't done any of it for money. She'd done it because she loved him. Full stop. That line has followed her for 25 years, quoted and requoted, because it captured something the tabloids never quite knew what to do with a woman who gave away parental rights to her own biological children, not out of coercion, but because she believed it was what was best for them and for him. Rowe's most consequential public moments came not during the marriage but afterward, when Jackson's life became consumed by legal battles. In 2005, during Jackson's child molestation trial, Rowe took the stand twice, on April 27 and April 28, and testified in his defense. She did not describe him as a predator. She described him instead as someone who was constantly being taken advantage of, surrounded, in her words, by people looking to exploit him for their own gain. It was a striking image. The ex-wife, no longer bound to him by marriage or money, choosing to stand up in open court and vouch for his character. Years earlier, in 2003, she had also participated in a lengthy filmed interview, reportedly lasting close to 10 hours, arranged in part to counter the damage done by a British documentary that had painted Jackson in an unflattering light. Rowe later testified that she was given a list of questions ahead of time but chose not to review them, wanting her answers to be genuine rather than rehearsed. She insisted, under oath, that nobody had scripted what she said. Her primary motivation, by her own account, was much simpler than any conspiracy. She wanted to reconnect with Jackson and with the children she hadn't seen regularly since the divorce. It took 9 months of persistent effort after that interview before she was allowed to see Prince and Paris again. Not everything about her position has been perfectly consistent. At one point, reports surfaced describing a conversation Rowe allegedly had with a sheriff's investigator, in which she was said to have described Jackson in far less flattering terms, suggesting he viewed his own children more as possessions than as people to be nurtured. If accurate, it stands in sharp contrast to her public defense of him. It's a reminder that Rowe's relationship with Jackson, like most real relationships, was not a single uncomplicated narrative of loyalty. It was messier than that, capable of holding both fierce defense and private frustration at the same time. To understand how strange Rowe's position really was, it helps to look at how the other woman in Jackson's romantic history saw her. Lisa Marie Presley knew about Rowe's devotion to Jackson years before the marriage ever happened, and she was one of the few people who stood by him during the storm of the 1993 allegations. Yet Presley, by her own later accounts, never viewed Rowe as any kind of romantic rival. Rowe's understated, unglamorous manner, a world away from the polish expected of anyone orbiting a superstar, made it easy for Presley to see her as a supportive presence in Jackson's life, rather than competition. Presley's own marriage to Jackson, which had captured global attention as a union between the king of pop and the daughter of the king of rock and roll, collapsed for reasons that had little to do with Rowe directly and everything to do with mismatched expectations about family. Jackson wanted children almost immediately. Presley, already raising a child from an earlier relationship, wasn't ready to rush into that again, and has said she felt real pressure from Jackson on the subject, pressure that included him invoking Rowe's willingness to have his children if Presley wouldn't. It stung her at the time, though she has since said she chalked it up to Jackson's own emotional blind spots rather than cruelty. That disagreement over family planning, more than any external rumor, was what ultimately pulled the marriage apart, and it set the stage almost immediately for Rowe to step into the role Presley wasn't ready to fill. Perhaps the most difficult chapter of Rowe's public record concerns Jackson's dependence on prescription medication. Years after his death, Rowe testified in the wrongful death lawsuit that Katherine Jackson filed against concert promoter AEG Live, which centered on the company's alleged failure to properly vet Dr. Conrad Murray, the physician later convicted of involuntary manslaughter for administering the fatal dose of propofol that killed Jackson in June 2009. In that testimony and in later interviews, Rowe described what she witnessed during her years working alongside Dr. Arnold Klein, the same dermatologist who had first introduced her to Jackson. She said Klein prescribed medications in her assessment that had little to do with any legitimate treatment Jackson needed, and she acknowledged her own role in facilitating his access to certain drugs, including Demerol, expressing genuine regret over it. Investigations following Jackson's death revealed that he had used numerous false names to obtain prescriptions over the years, and that Klein kept meticulous, if fraudulent, records of the transactions. Rowe has never tried to distance herself from that period. She has said she feels a measure of personal responsibility for not doing more to intervene while she still had influence in his life, a burden she has described in terms that suggest she has never fully forgiven herself for it. It's a rare thing in celebrity culture, someone close to a famous person's downfall who doesn't spend her public statements deflecting blame, but instead sits with it. It's worth sitting with just how unusual that admission is, coming from someone in her position. Most people connected to a celebrity's death spend their public statements protecting themselves, insisting they saw nothing, knew nothing, could have done nothing differently. Rowe did the opposite. She placed herself inside the chain of events that led to Jackson's overdose, not because any court required her to accept blame, but because she apparently believed it was true. She has drawn a direct line between her own past decisions, including, at times, removing people from Jackson's staff who might have provided steadier influence, and the vulnerabilities that were later exploited by Dr. Conrad Murray. Whether or not that self-assessment is entirely fair to her, it reveals a woman far more reflective about her own failures than the tabloid caricature of a paid-off ex-wife ever allowed for. After the 1999 divorce, Rowe largely disappeared from public view by choice. She sold her Beverly Hills home in the mid-2000s and bought a ranch in Palmdale, California, where she built a life around horse breeding about as far from Neverland as a person could get. In 2016, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She got through treatment with her 2 adult children, Paris and Prince, checking in on her, a detail that speaks to a relationship that, however unconventional in its early years, found its way toward something warmer as the children grew older. That relationship with Paris in particular has had its share of turbulence. The two barely knew each other during Paris's early childhood. They began to build an actual relationship only when Paris was around 13. In 2013, in one of the more painful